Hello, my name is Chyres Snyder, and I am a history major here at Acculturation. Today I'm going to explore the Chinese in Hawaii during the 19th century. Acculturation is defined as the cultural modification of an individual, group, or people by adapting to or borrowing traits from another culture. In my presentation, I will explain the ways of acculturation that the Chinese underwent in Hawaii towards becoming the Chinese-Hawaiian settlers. My research focuses on the study of the Chinese community and their unique development in the islands of Hawaii during the 19th century. Historians have created a plethora of scholarship in their unique process of acculturation. However, I highlight the magnitude of their transformation as immigrants who worked on sugar plantations to individuals of high prestige and importance to the development of Hawaii economically, socially, and culturally. I highlight the distinct transformation of the formerly overseas Chinese in Hawaii into the completely acculturated Chinese-Hawaiian. In the Chinese-Hawaiian communities, they gained a cohesive transnational identity and would form a definable culture as a result of immigrating to Hawaii. The Chinese-Hawaiian community were able to achieve this through establishing themselves as a collective force on the islands. Historians Eleanor Nordick and Richard Lee explain how much of an incredible development and effect that the Chinese on the islands have created, and illuminate their unique story in their studies. Their involvement in the islands of Hawaii is one that is absolute, as their profound contribution to Hawaii is what the islands are known for today. I hope to shed light into the revolutionary process of acculturation that the Chinese underwent in Hawaii, as their presence on the islands became fundamental towards the amelioration of Hawaii through leading in economic advances on the island, the application of homogeneous practices, as well as interracial marriages and ceremonial practices. The story begins during the 18th century. It started with the demand for sandalwood in China growing, and in response to this, Hawaiian King Kamehameha I agreed to a trade deal setting shipments of this material. This agreement introduced the islands into the growing global rise of capitalism and trade during the 18th century. King Kamehameha I enlisted Hawaiians as workers who would retrieve this trade commodity from their mountains. With the increase of global trade production between America and Europe, Hawaii started to participate in this eruption of trade opportunities. King Kamehameha I addressed the opportunity for Hawaii to benefit from the economic profit and progression of global trade initially through sandalwood, and furthered this with the introduction of sugar production to the islands. It is this that forged a connection between Hawaii and China. Also, due to the publication of Routes for British Admiralty in 1784, and based on Captain James Cook's journals and navigational charts, following his encounter with the islands, maritime workers weighed the possibility for utilizing the island as an important stop for Pacific Northwest East Asia commercial trading, and embarked on the journey to Hawaii. Hawaii would subsequently serve as a location which allowed the replenishment of resources and supplies, and also rest. Sojourner to settler. Chinese-Hawaiian communities ushered a strong economic platform in 19th century Hawaii. Their unique efforts initiated the Hawaiian Islands to formally enter into worldwide trade. In the 1850s, the development of sugar had become a major crop export on the islands. Hawaii's need for cheap agricultural laborers guided the way for the shipment of contract laborers in China. The Chinese became involved with indentured servitude in order to tend to the demands of sugar cultivation and processing. Most of the laborers were from the southeastern mainland provinces in China. The provinces, Guangdong and Fujian, enlisted Chinese male laborers who, during this time, were unable to find employment due to China's political and economic turmoil. Historians Nordick and Lee explain that with the decreeing of the Act for Government of Masters and Servants, passed by the Kingdom of Hawaii on June 21, 1850, this led to the authorization of the importation of laborers to serve as an apprenticed plantation workers on the islands. However, this was not permanent, as the terms of this agreement highlighted that laborers not exceed 5 years on the island. This then acted as their exodus from a homeland which many faced financial instability to an island which presented opportunities that many jumped to obtaining. From this point, scholars note the rapid growth of Chinese in Hawaii. The Chinese in Hawaii addressed the growing economic demand and covered foreign labor opportunities which were not offered in their homelands. However, Chinese workers faced severe and dehumanizing mistreatment on the plantation, though it was an evil that many had no other choice but to endure. In the 19th century, the Chinese completely dominated the sugar plantations on the islands, which boosted the Chinese-Hawaiian economy by tenfold. Historian Clarence Glick highlights how truly remarkable the contributions of the Chinese in Hawaii were. However, their efforts did not stop at simply addressing the economic demand of agricultural trade. What was once a migrant transformed into a settler in Hawaii. They altered their goal and expectation of one who accepted an opportunity of labor to the refining and the adjustment of themselves from Chinese to Chinese-Hawaiian. It is at this point where the acculturation occurs, and historian Clarence Glick asserts that what was once a settler becomes a sojourner. They are in alignment with their learned customs, beliefs, and ideals from China, but also subscribe to new customs, beliefs, and ideals from Hawaiian culture. The Chinese associate with their homeland and Hawaiian culture, hence Chinese-Hawaiian. Through the promotion of this dualism and nationality, they instill a jointness of the cultures they were born into and the culture which they introduced themselves to. Interracial marriages. Interracial marriage is the next topic of consideration in the effort towards understanding the distinct transformation of the formerly overseas Chinese in Hawaii into the completely acculturated Chinese-Hawaiian immigrant. In the later part of the 20th century, the Chinese community were the fifth largest ethnic group in Hawaii. Their total population nearing the end of the 20th century comprised of 5.9% of the population. So, it is important to note the decline of the total population of the Chinese community in Hawaii. This is mostly associated with the restrictive immigration laws set out to control the incoming number of immigrants, namely those who were Chinese. The apprehensions centered around how strongly the Chinese community represented the labor sector. In 1883, the Hawaiian Cabinet Council passed a decree which targeted the restriction of Chinese immigration to only 2,400 men a year, and also demanded the Chinese leaving the islands needed to obtain a passport to prove previous residence if they were expected to return. Chinese male agricultural laborers who migrated to Hawaii would actually go on to marry native Hawaiian women on the islands, which allowed them the additional opportunity to assert themselves as a progressing community in Hawaii. Historians note that this furthered the development of Chinese-Hawaiian communities on the islands due to their status as now permanent settlers who showed a commitment to specifically trade production, but also the cumulative success of Hawaii. This pioneered the progression of their status in Hawaii through economic and political development via marital ties. In the picture you all see, it is a family of interracial marriage between a Chinese man and a Hawaiian woman. Children produced from Chinese and Hawaiian marriages became even more capable of securing a high-paying labor opportunity due to their direct tie to Hawaiian culture. Their status of Hawaiian-born and Chinese, though more westernized descendants, have continued this trend upward in addition to their own ability to abandon the plantation setting and transition to higher stake jobs. Finally, with the fusion of two cultures and ethics, this leads to the introduction of the ceremonial practices and fused Chinese-Hawaiian festivals within the Chinese-Hawaiian communities. Ceremonial practices and fused Chinese-Hawaiian festivals. Their initial impact to Hawaii was more or less centered around agriculture and trade production. However, this would soon change. In the past 2 centuries, historians note the gravity of the collective efforts for the progression of Hawaii that the Chinese-Hawaiian community made such valuable contributions to the economic, social, and political essence of the islands. In relation to the high concentration of people whose history on the islands is part of a history of immigration, Hawaii as a whole historically became a metropolitan for an entire hub of citizens whose lineage stretches from immigrating to the islands. Scholar Barbara Smith explains that through immigration, the Chinese-Hawaiian community on the island developed a cohesive bicultural lifestyle by combining components of their Chinese heritage with that of Hawaiian culture. In Hawaii, citizens with Chinese ancestry are recognized as an important aspect of Hawaiians' multinational society as an entirety. Defining the Chinese-Hawaiian identity. Historians note that what was simply a Chinese-Hawaiian hub or community went on to evolve into Hawaii's Chinatown. a district that was linked to the importance of the history of Chinese in Hawaii. This was and continues to be incredibly noteworthy and imperative to the Hawaii as a whole. In time, the influence of the Chinese residents of Hawaii expanded from economic development to contributing to the island's cultural environment by the establishment of Chinese music and ritualistic festivals. For example, specifically in Honolulu, they celebrated the festival of Zheng Ming, which is one that is considered to be pure and bright. Zheng Ming is an annual Chinese ritual where families honor their ancestors by visiting their graves. It involves many things with respect to their instilled Chinese ancestry and has been observed since the introduction to the islands of the Chinese in the 19th century. It demonstrates the ongoing strength and consistent connection between the overseas Chinese and the homeland. Scholar Frederick Lau comments that this festival is one that is quintessence to the ethnic family traditions that have emerged as an integral part of the cultural scape, reflecting the multi-ethnic makeup of Hawaiian society since the Plantation Days at the turn of the 20th century. Lau states the present reality of Hawaii being considered a multi-ethnic society not only highlights the transition from Chinese formerly being provisional migrants, one whose purpose centered around plantation and agriculture production, but also aims to note the process of transforming into a community central to the history of Hawaii, and is also central to the collective history of Chinese-Hawaiian groups on the island. The understanding of the Chinese-Hawaiian ceremonial practices is crucial to the task and the understanding of the generational development of acculturation to the island of Hawaii. In combining the application of traditions and ceremonial practices, this revolutionizes the idea of the Chinese-Hawaiian community in Hawaii and is considered to be a symbolic manifestation of society. The Chinese-Hawaiian. In consideration of this, the Chinese immigrant created a special path towards establishing themselves as a collective force as their presence on the islands became fundamental towards the reformation of Hawaii through leading in economic advancement, the application of homogeneous practices, as well as interracial marriage and ceremonial practices. In subscribing to a distinct type of group loyalty to Hawaii, the Chinese-Hawaiian community displayed their commitment and patronage to the islands through these themes. Through their participation in these several channels, this aided in the development of Hawaii towards becoming a metropolitan island. Through their contributions, they gained a status from becoming sojourner to settler in their demonstration of their Chinese ancestry and in adopting Hawaiian culture and customs. The Chinese-Hawaiian body not only asserted their community in Hawaii as a branch from the homeland, but with also interrelation to Hawaii as a whole.